1984 was a turning point in the history of capital punishment in America. With 21 executions carried out, it became the most active year since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. In this video, we'll walk through each case, what led them to death row, and the haunting last words they spoke. Anthony "Tony" Anton was executed on January 26, 1984, in Florida's electric chair for arranging the contract killing of private investigator Richard Cloud on October 23, 1975. He was 66 years old at the time and had maintained his innocence, claiming he never participated in the murder-for-hire scheme. Prosecutors argued that crime boss Victor Acosta gave Anton the job of hiring two killers, one of whom ultimately testified against him to avoid harsher punishment. Records about Anton's final hours are sparse, but prison officials noted he spent the evening in a calm, reflective state. According to a witness account, he declined to offer a detailed public statement, choosing only to say, "I hope God forgives us all." Reports suggest that for his last meal, Anton received the standard Florida prison fare rather than a special order. Shortly after midnight, guards escorted him to the chamber where his sentence was carried out. He was pronounced dead shortly thereafter, marking the end of nearly a decade of legal battles. While some questioned the trial's outcome, the state proceeded in accordance with the court's ruling, closing Anthony Anton's case forever at 66. James David Autri. James David Autri was executed by lethal injection in Texas on March 14, 1984, for fatally shooting two people and severely injuring a third at a convenience store in Jefferson County. Born on August 27, 1954, Autri already had a record of violent offenses, including convictions for assault, attempted robbery, and burglary. On April 20, 1980, at age 25, he visited a convenience store and argued with 43-year-old clerk Shirley Drouet over the cost of a six-pack of beer. Autri pulled out a .38 caliber pistol and shot her between the eyes, causing her death. He then turned the gun on two bystanders. Investigators determined the shootings were unprovoked and rooted in anger over a small price dispute. Autri was sentenced to die later that year. Despite several legal battles, his sentence stood, and prison officials carried out his execution at Huntsville's death chamber. He declined to provide any final remarks before being pronounced dead, and public records do not indicate he requested a special last meal. Ronald Clark O'Brien, Texas, March 31, 1984. Nicknamed the Candyman, Ronald Clark O'Brien was convicted of fatally poisoning his 8-year-old son Timothy, cyanide-laced Halloween candy on October 31, 1974. Prosecutors argued he intended to collect on a $20,000 life insurance policy, having recently boosted coverage on both Timothy and his daughter, Elizabeth. Also handed out tainted sweets to other children to mask his involvement, though none of them ingested the poison. O'Brien's suspicious behavior, purchasing large insurance policies and giving contradictory statements, sparked an intense investigation in Pasadena, Texas. The jury found him guilty of capital murder in 1975, labeling the crime especially heinous due to its targeting of a child. Despite appeals and widespread media coverage, the courts upheld his death sentence. Last hours and execution. On March 31, 1984, O'Brien was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. In a final public statement, he called the execution wrong, but claimed it did not invalidate the entire justice system. He offered forgiveness to those involved in his death and asked for forgiveness for his own failings. Official records do not note a special last meal, only that O'Brien was treated well by correctional personnel. He was pronounced dead shortly after midnight. Elmo Patrick Sonier, Louisiana, April 5, 1984. Elmo Patrick Sonier was sentenced to death for the 1977 rape and murder of 18-year-old Loretta Bourque and the murder of her 16-year-old boyfriend, David LeBlanc. Sonier committed the crime alongside his brother Eddie. Evidence at trial showed that Patrick and Eddie abducted the couple, forced them into a car, and drove them to a remote oil field. Patrick sexually assaulted Bourque. Both victims were then shot execution style. A jury convicted Patrick of first-degree murder, citing his active role in planning the attack. Eddie received a separate sentence. Sonier's time on death row drew attention when Sister Helen Prejean, a well-known anti-death penalty advocate, became his spiritual advisor. He was the first of several inmates whose stories she would later chronicle in the book Dead Man Walking. Execution. On April 5, 1984, Sonier was electrocuted at Angola State Penitentiary. He reportedly spent his final hours in prayer, reflecting on his actions. Sister Prejean remained at his side, providing counsel. His execution further fueled public discussions on morality and the death penalty, eventually leading to major media adaptations of Prejean's experiences. Arthur Frederick Good III, Florida, April 5, 1984. A self-admitted child molester, Arthur Frederick Good III was convicted of the killings of 2 young boys in 1976, one in Maryland and one in Florida. Officials labeled him a danger to children based on his extensive history of sexual abuse. In March 1976, Good lured and strangled 9-year-old Jason Verdow in Fort Myers, Florida, after telling the child he was about to die. Fleeing north, he abducted 11-year-old Kenneth Dawson in Virginia, also strangling him while another child witnessed the crime. Police captured Good days later after a recognized companion called authorities. Good underwent psychiatric examinations indicating borderline intellectual functioning. Despite an insanity defense attempt, found him responsible for murder and kidnapping, Florida imposing a death sentence for the killing on its soil. Maryland courts also issued a separate life sentence for the additional homicide. On April 5, 1984, Florida electrocuted the 30-year-old Good. Notoriously, he made disturbing remarks in his final hours, at one point requesting a young boy be brought to him. He offered minimal remorse, stating only that he regretted killing the children, but had difficulty showing it. Authorities denied his last request for any special indulgence. James Adams, Florida, May 10, 1984. James Adams was convicted of beating and killing Fort Pierce rancher Edgar Brown in 1973. Prosecutors said Adams entered Brown's residence with the intent to rob him, using a fireplace poker to deliver fatal blows. At the time of the murder, Adams had escaped a Tennessee prison where he was serving a 99-year sentence for rape. Though Adams always maintained his innocence, prosecutors presented witnesses claiming they saw his vehicle near the crime scene. Stolen household items were discovered in his wife's car. The jury voted 7-5 for the death penalty, and the judge confirmed the sentence. Adams's appeals centered on alleged racial bias, as he was a black man tried by an all-white panel and evidence that was reportedly suppressed. Execution. Officials carried out his electrocution at Florida State Prison on May 10, 1984, making him the first black man executed in Florida since 1964. Adams delivered a brief apology, expressing sorrow if his death brought closure to those affected. Throughout his incarceration, he insisted on wrongful conviction, but lacked the legal means to overturn the verdict. Ivan Ray Stanley, Georgia, July 12, 1984. In April 1976, insurance collector Clifford Floyd was brutally killed in Decatur County, Georgia. Stanley and an accomplice, Joseph Thomas, were convicted of kidnapping Floyd, beating him with multiple objects, and ultimately burying him alive in a shallow grave. Evidence revealed the men robbed Floyd, tying him to a tree and forcing him to give up his wallet. The assault escalated viciously, culminating in Thomas and Stanley striking Floyd and covering his still-breathing body with dirt. 2 days later, detectives found Floyd's abandoned car and traced incriminating phone calls to Thomas's home. Stanley was soon apprehended. Thomas confessed in detail. Both men were charged with capital murder. At trial, Thomas testified against Stanley, describing how they systematically planned to get rid of Floyd. The court deemed the crime especially heinous, sentencing Stanley to death. Thomas received a separate sentence. Execution. After years of limited appeals, Georgia carried out Stanley's electrocution on July 12, 1984. Witnesses called the crime one of the most savage murders in the county's memory. Stanley gave no substantial final address, and the state upheld the punishment as a deterrent. Ernest John Dobert Jr., Florida, September 7, 1984. Dobert was convicted of killing his 9-year-old daughter, Kaylee Ann, and of second-degree murder in the death of his 7-year-old son, Ryder. Authorities alleged Dobert subjected his children to ongoing abuse, ultimately causing the fatalities. Their remains were never recovered, but his surviving children testified to seeing the killings in 1971. A Florida jury recommended life imprisonment by a 10-2 margin, expressing doubt about whether he intended to kill. However, the trial judge overrode that recommendation and imposed a death sentence. Execution. Dobert's attorneys argued insufficient evidence since the children's bodies were not found. The courts relied heavily on eyewitness accounts from other siblings. Appeals contended the judge's override violated sentencing norms, but the Florida Supreme Court upheld the decision. Governor Bob Graham signed Dobert's warrant, emphasizing the seriousness of child abuse crimes. Dobert was electrocuted at Florida State Prison on September 7, 1984, after a reported reconciliation with one surviving daughter. He offered no lengthy public statement, but family sources claimed he showed remorse privately. The case spurred debates on judicial overrides and the broader handling of child abuse homicides. James Dri Henry, Florida, on September 20, 1984. James Dri Henry was put to death for the 1974 murder of 81-year-old civil rights leader Zellie Riley in Orlando, Florida. According to investigators, Henry broke into Riley's home intending to commit a robbery, making off with $64 in credit cards. Riley died from asphyxiation after being gagged and left bound. Papers at the time gave only modest attention to Riley, focusing instead on a white police officer whom Henry wounded during his apprehension. Prosecutors offered Henry a plea deal, plead guilty for a life sentence, but he refused and proceeded to trial. The jury voted 7-5 in favor of death. Over the subsequent decade, Henry repeatedly challenged his sentence. Late appeals asserted that he had significant brain damage and limited intellectual ability. The courts ruled his claims came too late for relief. Despite enduring questions about his competency and mental state, Florida set his execution for September 20, 1984, at Florida State Prison. Speaking briefly before going to the electric chair, Henry proclaimed his innocence, insisting he was wrongfully condemned. Witnesses present for the execution reported that he remained calm, offering scant detail beyond his final declaration. The state pronounced him dead shortly after sunrise that day. Lynwood Earl Bryley, Virginia, on October 12, 1984. Lynwood Earl Bryley was a central figure in a notorious killing spree that terrorized Richmond, Virginia, through much of 1979. Along with his brothers, James and Anthony, and accomplice Duncan Meekins, Lynwood participated in a series of robberies, beatings, and murders, victims of varied backgrounds. Among the most shocking incidents was the abduction and murder of local disc jockey John Gallagher, who was forced into his own car trunk. The Bryley gang was especially brutal, often ransacking victims' homes and showing little concern for the lives they destroyed. Lynwood himself committed several of the homicides. A jury handed him a death sentence specifically for abducting and murdering Gallagher. He, along with James, spent time on Virginia's death row. Officials scheduled his electrocution for October 12, 1984. Lynwood died in the electric chair at the Virginia State Penitentiary. Thomas Andy Barefoot, Texas, on October 30, 1984. Thomas Andy Barefoot was condemned for the August 7, 1978, killing of 31-year-old Heights police officer Carl Levin. Barefoot's underlying motive was to avoid arrest for another serious crime. Shot Levin in the head with a .25 caliber handgun. The murder triggered an intense manhunt, engaging local authorities, Texas Rangers, and the FBI. Within days, Barefoot was captured and put on trial. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors emphasized the ruthless nature of shooting a uniformed police officer. In 1979, Barefoot was sentenced to die by lethal injection. He appealed multiple times, challenging both his guilt and the constitutionality of capital punishment. His case sparked debate after the Supreme Court briefly granted him a stay in January 1983, despite having rejected a nearly identical last-minute plea in the case of Charlie Brooks 1 month earlier. Observers noted the seeming inconsistency, but eventually the courts allowed his death sentence to stand. On October 30th, 1984, the Supreme Court turned down Barefoot's final appeal around mid-morning. He was executed hours later, making him the 25th person to die under Texas's post-1976 death penalty. Margie Velma Barfield, North Carolina, on November 2nd, 1984. Margie Velma Barfield, often referred to by the media as Death Row Granny, was the first woman executed in the U.S. after the 1976 reinstatement of capital punishment, and the first since 1962 overall. Born in 1932, she struggled with addiction to prescription drugs, forging checks to finance her habit. Between 1969 and 1978, Barfield poisoned multiple individuals with arsenic, including her mother and 2 elderly acquaintances for whom she provided care. The crime that finally led to her conviction was the 1977 murder of Stuart Taylor, her fiancé. Suspecting he had learned of her financial misdeeds, she slipped rat poison into his beverages. Taylor died in the hospital soon after, prompting an autopsy that revealed lethal arsenic levels. A subsequent investigation uncovered more suspicious deaths tied to Barfield. She insisted she only aimed to make victims mildly ill and nurse them while finding a way to repay stolen funds. A North Carolina jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. Appeals argued that her addiction and psychological issues drove her actions, but courts upheld the sentence. On November 2, 1984, she was administered a lethal injection at Central Prison in Raleigh. In final interviews, Barfield sought forgiveness from victims' families, leaving behind an unsettling chapter in female serial homicide. Timothy Charles Palms, Florida, on November 8, 1984. Timothy Charles Palms was sentenced to die for the gruesome October 4, 1976, murder of Jacksonville furniture store owner James Stone. Palms, alongside co-defendant Ronald Straight, lured Stone to an apartment under the guise of a business meeting. In a brutal sequence lasting roughly half an hour, beaten with a hammer, stabbed multiple times, and had several fingers amputated. The assailants then placed him in a wooden box and dumped it in the St. Johns River. Stone was robbed of his car, money, and valuables. Police arrested Palms and Straight in California after a nationwide alert. At trial, the horror of the crime deeply impacted the jury. Both men were convicted of first-degree murder. The state deemed their actions particularly vile. Palms received a death warrant. Straight likewise faced the electric chair, executed later in 1986. On November 8, 1984, Florida carried out Palms's electrocution. His final appeals were denied, including a last-minute stay that briefly postponed a scheduled double execution, which also involved another inmate. Palms did not publicly recant but expressed remorse for his actions. He was pronounced dead shortly after dawn at Florida State Prison. Robert Lee Willie, Louisiana, on December 28, 1984. Robert Lee Willie gained notoriety through his role in the 1980 kidnap, rape, and murder of 18-year-old Faith Hathaway near Franklinton, Louisiana. With co-defendant Joseph Vaccaro, Willie held Hathaway captive, assaulted her, and then stabbed her repeatedly. Each man claimed the other dealt the fatal blow. Hathaway's body was found in a wooded area, sparking outrage across the region. During a high-profile trial, both men faced capital charges. Willie was also implicated in other violent crimes, including a separate kidnap and rape. Sister Helen Prejean, a Catholic nun and prominent anti-death penalty advocate, visited him on death row, later detailing her experiences with him in her book Dead Man Walking. That account served as partial inspiration for the film's fictionalized convict, Matthew Poncelet. After the courts affirmed Willie's death sentence, officials scheduled his electrocution at Angola State Penitentiary on December 28, 1984. In a final statement, Willie apologized to Hathaway's family yet condemned the practice of killing people to show killing is wrong. Witnesses described his last moments as unflinching. Willie asked that the execution hood briefly be removed, offering a wink toward Sister Helen in the death chamber. Louisiana pronounced him dead moments later.